Welcome back to another episode of Horror Short Stories. And tonight's scary story is titled, The Walls Were Bleeding Again. Let's begin. The room was cold, the floorboards creaked, and something kept scratching at the door. Thomas shifted uncomfortably on the lumpy mattress, pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders, and tried not to think about the sound. He really should have brought a friend. Now he wished he'd listened to his own advice. He always told people not to go to the old Victorian house alone, but now he was in for a night that he would never forget. He'd come to the house with good intentions to fix it up. In fact, to make it livable again. It had been abandoned for decades and was said to be haunted. It took him some time to find the place. He drove around the outskirts of the town following vague directions that he'd found online. But when he finally saw the house, he knew he was there. It looked like the type of place where ghosts walked through the halls at night and whispered secrets to each other. There were cobwebs hanging from every corner and vines growing up the side, wrapping themselves around the rusted weather vane. But once he got inside, he could see the potential. Underneath all the grime was a beautiful house. Or at least it had been. The walls were peeling, and the wallpaper was coming off in strips. The stairs creaked, and the banisters were covered in dust. But Thomas didn't mind. He liked the way the sunlight streamed through the dusty windows and illuminated motes of dust dancing in the air. But when the sun went down, the shadows grew longer, and the house seemed to shift and change. By the time the sky was filled with stars, Thomas was regretting his decision to stay. Every time he turned around, it was like the house itself was watching him. It was like a predator sizing up its prey. That was when the scratching began. He told himself it was just mice, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. He'd seen the horror movies. He knew better than to investigate strange noises in the middle of the night. So he stayed in bed. At first, the scratching was faint, but then it grew louder and more insistent. Then he heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate. He buried his head under his blanket and squeezed his eyes shut. In the morning, he got up and found scratches on the door, long and deep, like claws. He ran a finger along them, feeling the grooves left by sharp nails. Then he saw something else, something that made him gasp. The paint was peeling away, revealing the wood underneath, and the wood had writing carved into it. Writing that looked an awful lot like a name. Thomas ran a finger across the letters, committing them to memory. He wanted to get a better look, to try to make out the rest of the carving, but the paint was too thick. He needed to get it off. So he pulled out a can of paint stripper and got to work. As the paint stripper ate away at the paint, he could feel his heart beating faster. What if what was carved into the door wasn't a name at all? What if it was a warning? The paint came off in thick chunks, revealing more of the inscription. It wasn't a name, it was a date, one he recognized with a jolt. It was the same date that the house had been built. But that wasn't possible. Houses weren't built with dates carved into their doors. So why was this one? Is there some kind of explanation? Some logical reason that Thomas had missed? Maybe it was a quirk of the builder, a strange habit, or maybe something else. He needed answers, so he decided to do some research. He went to the local library and pored over old yearbooks, city directories, and newspapers. But he couldn't find anything about the house or the family that had lived there. It was like the house had been erased from history. As days turned into weeks, he continued his search, scoured the internet, looking at old maps and tax records, but he couldn't find anything. He was starting to get discouraged. Was he wasting his time? Did he ever know what the date meant? Or why it was carved into the door? Then one day he found something. Found a faded photograph of the house, and in the background, he saw a name. It was the name of the family that had lived there. They'd only lived there for a few years before they'd sold the house and moved away. But why? What had happened to them? Thomas was determined to find out. He tracked down one of their descendants and asked her if she knew anything about the house. She did. She told him that her family had put the house up for sale because it was haunted. She'd heard strange noises and felt cold spots throughout the house. And then one day she'd found scratches on the door, just like Thomas had found. But there was more. Her great-grandmother had taken her own life in the house. She'd hung herself in the attic. Since then, the house had never been the same. Thomas thanked her for her help and hung up the phone. He knew what he had to do. He packed up his things and got ready to leave. As he walked through the house for the last time, he could feel the weight of its history pressing down on him. could almost hear the whispers of the past. When he got to the attic door, he hesitated. Should he go up there? Not if he found something he wasn't supposed to. Curiosity got the better of him. He pushed the door open and started to climb the stairs. The attic was dark and dusty. Cobwebs hung from the rafters, and the floor was littered with debris. Amos moved carefully, not wanting to disturb anything. That's when he saw it. Hanging from the rafter was a noose made of rope. It was old and frayed, but it was still there. He knew what he had to do. Took a deep breath, climbed up onto a chair, and put the noose around his neck. This was crazy. He knew that. But something about the house, about the attic, about the noose, compelled him to go through with it. He tightened the knot and stepped off the chair. The rope was rough against his skin, digging into his neck. But he didn't care. He wanted to see what would happen. What if this was the only way to find out what had happened to the family that lived in the house? What if this was the key to unlocking the mystery? As the noose tightened around his neck, he felt a strange sense of calm. He knew he was taking a risk, but he was willing to take it. He closed his eyes and waited. When he opened them again, he was in a different place. He was standing in the same attic, but it was different. The walls were covered in scribblings, and in the center of the room was a mirror. He walked toward the mirror, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. And that's when he saw them, the family that had lived in the house. They were standing in front of him, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear, and then they started to speak. Their voices were raspy and faint, like whispers in the wind. They told him that they were trapped in the house, that they couldn't leave because something evil was keeping them there. They begged him to help them, to break the curse that was afflicting them. He wanted to help them, but he didn't know how. Just then, he saw the noose lying on the floor. An idea struck him. If the curse was tied to the house, then maybe it could be broken by leaving. Maybe all he had to do was take the noose with him. He picked it up and tied it around his neck. The family watched him, their eyes filled with hope. He tightened the knot and stepped back. The noose was tight, cutting off his air supply, but he didn't care. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and stepped through the mirror. He was back in the attic, but it was different now. The walls were bare, the mirror was gone, and the family was nowhere to be seen. He took off the noose and let himself slide down the chair. He knew he had done the right thing. He had freed the family from the curse that had held them for so long. But as he walked out of the attic and down the stairs, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He looked over his shoulder, but there was nothing there. As he stepped outside, he glanced back at the house. It looked different somehow, like the darkness had lifted. He got in his car and drove away from the house. As he did, he looked back one last time. That's when he saw it. The walls were bleeding again. Long red streaks were running down the side of the house, dripping down like blood. He slammed on the brakes and turned the car around. He had to go back. He had to see what was happening. But as he turned the car around, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder and saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, silhouetted against the darkness. The figure was tall and thin, and it seemed to be beckoning to him with one finger. He knew he should keep going, that he should put as much distance between himself and the house as possible. But he couldn't help himself. He turned the car around and headed back to the house. As he got closer, he could see that the figure had stepped out of the woods and was now standing in the middle of the road. It was still beckoning to him, and he knew he had to stop the car. He got out of the car and walked toward the figure. The closer he got, the more detail he could see. The figure was wearing a long, flowing dress, and its face was pale and gaunt. Its eyes were dark and bottomless. He reached out a hand to touch it, but it stepped back. It turned its head and looked at him. That's when he knew. He wasn't dealing with a human being. This was a ghost, and it wanted him to follow it back to the house. He hesitated. Should he listen to the ghost? What if it was leading him to danger? But his curiosity got the better of him. He followed the ghost back to the house. The ghost led him to the front door and then turned around. It motioned with its hand for him to enter the house. He hesitated. What if something evil was waiting for him inside? But he knew that there was only one way to find out. He opened the door and stepped inside. So I hope you enjoyed the horror short story, The Walls Were Bleeding Again. And if you did, please consider subscribing and following. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time for another terrifying tale.